You're with God, day 31. The reading today was out of Nehemiah, and it's one of Nehemiah's prayers in which he's been facing opposition. And it's just a couple of verses. Nehemiah's been facing opposition, and Nehemiah responds to it by praying essentially that God would judge the people who are opposing him. And in the commentary, they took a different approach than what I'm used to seeing in commentaries. When I read commentaries on prayers like that, most often they tend to reflect on the fact that Nehemiah was praying rather than acting. He was praying for God's judgment on his enemies, and it was probably just, and so on and so forth. That wasn't the view they had here. The view they had here, they pointed out right away that Nehemiah's response was very, very different than Jesus' response when Jesus says, "Love your enemies." And here Nehemiah is essentially praying judgment on his enemies. And we see that a lot in other places in the Old Testament. But their take on it was not to justify Nehemiah's frustration or anger towards his enemies, but rather to point out that what Nehemiah is doing is the heartfelt response of somebody who's not perfect, is human, but it was his heartfelt response to the situation he was facing, and his taking that heartfelt response to God. And the emphasis of what they were saying is that God can handle our heartfelt responses, even if they're not the responses that we think or know that they should be. But that God already knows who we are, and so we can take anything that we have to God, anything we're feeling, whether it's right or not, doesn't really matter, but we can still take it to God, and we can pour out and empty out our hearts before God, and He can handle anything that we say or we think or we throw at Him. And the encouragement at the end of the devotion was not to try to put on your best face before God, because God already knows who we are, but rather to pour out our hearts to God as we are, and not always as we wish we would be. And that's okay, because God accepts us as we are, and it's when we acknowledge who we are and where we are and what we're thinking and what we're feeling. So when we do that before God in prayer, that God is able to step into those areas and transform us more into the image of Christ that we want to be. Whereas if we isolate that, shut that off, try to hide it from God, we're not keeping God from seeing those areas of our lives. What we're doing is we're keeping God from addressing and dealing with those areas of our lives and transforming us more into the image of Christ. So, those are my thoughts on day 31.